Welcome back to our Aprilia Supertwin fast bike build, and today we have the engine on the bench because we're going to take the head off because it's going away for a bit of gas flowing. The first job though is to strip a bit of the unnecessary stuff off it, so some of the emission stuff, so the pair valve pipe work can come off it, the solenoid can come off it, and I'll whip off a couple of water pipes and bits like that just so we've got less stuff to clutter up the bench. Rob is just taking the clutch cover off. The nice easy trick when he gets the bolts out is you can sort of force the cover off by turning the clutch actuator. So we need to strip the cams and then the valves and everything out of the head, so the cams will come out before the head comes off, but the Aprilia engine has a crank position that you lock it in so that you can actually basically get the timing right to take the cams out and everything like that, and the timing inspection point is behind this cover and we need access to the crank, so Rob's taking that off, and of course a bit of oil dribbles everywhere, hence why we've got the rag out. The primary drive gear that drives to the clutch, in it has a hole we can see in there, and that lines up with the hole in the crankcase. So when those holes line up, then the holes on each of the camshafts will line up, and that's where you set your timing on these Aprilia engines. And so what we now need to do is turn the crank round to get those holes to line up. It's actually easier though to do it with the nut on the alternator, and so what we're going to do is turn the engine round, take the alternator cover off and turn it round with that. We could try turning it with this, but that's not as strong as the alternator nut, and there will be resistance from the valve springs, so it's better to do it from the alternator side. Alternator side cover now removed, including the drive for the water pump, and so drive for the water pump, alternator, well, generator winding, whatever you want to call it, and I've put a little bit of rag in there because that's part of the water gallery, and so what we don't want is any damp that's left in there dribbling all over these bits, so I've just popped a bit of rag in there for now. So now we can put a nut on the end of the crank on this side, turn the engine over easier, and make sure we get our timing points located so we can lock everything in position. So as I turn the spanner on one side, the primary drive is moving and the cams are moving, so now we just have to wait until we get all of the holes lined up, and it's actually easier to see the ones on the cams. So that's going to be fairly close, and if we look down here we can see the holes lining up down there. Let's go backwards a little bit, and then we'll get ourselves a 5mm bolt and we'll pop it in the holes. Because we're taking apart and not putting together, we don't need all of the positions locking, we just want to lock the crank in position, so I've got a 5mm bolt popped in the hole. I'm sure there's an official Aprilia tool for it, but it's just a 5mm pin, so a 5mm bolt works quite well. If we're putting back together, or when we're putting back together, we'll be pinning everything in place, but we don't need to because we're taking this apart. So what I'm going to do next is crack the bolts off that hold the cam sprockets to the cams, because we're having different camshafts, and then I'm going to take the cam chain tensioner out. So there'll be a top cap with a 5 or 6mm headed Allen screw in it. We'll take that out, and then there'll be a bigger hex behind here to take the actual tensioner out complete. So this is the tensioner that actually sits inside the cylinder head, and inside here there's like a plastic blade, a rubbery plastic blade, and this pushes on. So this has got quite a lot of spring pressure to it. It is hydraulically fed as well, so once it's full of oil, even if the spring failed, it wouldn't actually move too far back. So you can see there's quite a lot of spring there, and that pressure puts tension onto the cam chain, but now the tensioner is out, the chain is loose, these are loose because we need to take them off. So the next thing we can do is actually undo the cam cover, and bit by bit we're going to crack the nut bolts off and slowly release them, because there will be a little bit of spring pressure, so we'll slowly open that up and then we can slide the cams out. Very nicely, Aprilia have actually labelled the post positions. So this one's number 12, there'll be number 11 over there. So there's an order, really the order is designed for tightening it up. So you pull the cam down nice and smoothly and evenly, but they are useful for when you're undoing. So Rob's just going through one by one, cracking them off in the correct order so it releases the tension evenly, and then bit by bit we'll literally just take the bolts out so the spring tension on the cams pushes them up nice and evenly. If you try and take, say, one side off completely beforehand, the spring tension can actually damage the cam carrier. With the cam cover now removed, it's just a case of lifting the cams out, slotting the cam chain off the end of it and popping them somewhere safe. And now that we've got the cams out, what you've got here is the valve bucket. So it's basically an upturned bucket with a shim and then the valve and the spring and bits underneath it. We'll be getting involved in them in a minute, but what we need to do first is actually take the cylinder head off. So we're going to undo the two little bolts down here and then the big nuts there down the other end. There is 6 of them. We need to take them off and then we can wiggle the cylinder head off the engine. And with all the fasteners removed, the next thing we need to do is actually get the cylinder head off the studs, and that's moving relatively easily. There will be dowels that hold it in position. Sometimes, just to get it sort of moving to begin with, you have to give it a very light tap with like a plastic or a rubber hammer, but we're not going to have to do that today. So Rob can put his hammer away, which I know is very disappointing for him, and then he can come and lift the cylinder head off the studs. And there we go, one cylinder head off the block. Nice. So the tuning work we're having done to the head involves gas flowing. So in effect what that does is it's cleaning up and altering the shape of the ports so the gas can flow easier. Therefore you get more air and fuel mixture into your cylinders. And so we need to take the valves out, which are down there. Down there, in fact. And to do that, what we need to do is get a magnet. We need to lift the shim up, and stuck underneath the bucket is the shim. So in fact lift the bucket up to get the shim out. So bucket and shim, and then we're going to put those over here, and because this is inlet side it can go in number 1 inlet. This is a lot easier with 2 hands. So that can go in there, and then we're going to take all the buckets and shims out, and then we're going to use a spring compressor to take the valves out. Right, so now we have all the buckets and shims out, we need to use the spring compressor, and we'll hook that in there, have part of it against the actual valve head itself, and then we wind the spring compressor down, and that's going to compress our valve spring. And with the valve spring compressed, it pushes the top retainer down. Then we can get in with a magnet, pick one collet out, put it in the bucket, and then a little wiggle, second collet out in the bucket, and then when we release the valve spring compressor, that lets the tension off the spring, fish the spring compressor out of the way. We can take the retainer, the springs, there's 2 of them, out. They can go in there, and then if I push on the valve with my finger, just pop, and there we go. Inlet valve out. 1 down, 7 to go. So with the valves, springs, retainers, collet, shims and buckets removed, this head is as plain as it needs to be. At the bottom of here, the spring actually sits on another, it looks like another retainer. It sits on a plate that stops the spring rubbing on the aluminium of the cylinder head. On these heads, that can't come off with the valve stem seal in place, which we're not removing, and so that can stay in for now. But that head is now stripped, and it can go to have its ports tickled. So with the magic of YouTube, a few days later, and our cylinder head is back. So what's been done is cleaning up the ports. And so you can see in here all the sort of original casting marks and stuff have been removed so the gas can flow a little bit nicer. And the shape of the inlet port has actually been changed ever so slightly. So the gas going into the cylinder will fill the cylinder more effectively. So we're going to get a bigger volume of gas and therefore air and fuel mix, basically, that's what we're talking about, into the engine. And therefore we can get more horsepower. And so the next thing we need to do is put the valves back in, but what I like to do is just put a tiny bit of grinding paste on them and just relap the valve seats in to make sure we get an absolutely perfect seal on every valve. Lapping the valves back in it probably doesn't need doing. The seats look absolutely pristine, but we want to make sure the valve sealing is absolutely perfect. So we have number one exhaust valve. I have a little bit of valve grinding paste. Smear that around the valve a little bit. So I've got my valve grinding paste on there, and then I like to put a little dribble of oil on the valve stem, just so that when it's sitting going through the seat and the seal, it's not sitting in there dry. So little smear of oil, and then we'll drop that down number one's hole, slide it in, past the seal. Then I'm going to get my valve lapping stick, my sucker, stick it on there. It doesn't stick very well to these exhaust valves because they're quite a rough sort of cast finish, but we just need to get it to sit on there enough. And we're going to do these just little movements, and that just forces the lapping paste between the valve and the seat. We're only going to take a minute or so to do each one, and this just makes sure there's no little imperfections on the seat or on the valve. Then we're going to just pop the valve back out, and what you should get is this almost perfectly uniform sort of matte area on the valve, and you can see that's absolutely perfect on the valve. And I should just clean the seat up as well, make sure that looks the same, and that's absolutely perfect. We've got a really nice uniform seat all the way around on the valve. Because these are fairly new, I was expecting them to come up quite nicely. If you've got an older cylinder head and older valves, it will take longer to get the imperfections out of the seat and off the valve, but it is worth doing to get an absolutely spot on seal. So all my valves now have this nice uniform ring that they'll seal to, and the seats are all the same, so just sort of a slightly matted bit where they've been lapped in. They probably didn't really need doing, but it just makes sure that the seats are absolutely spot on. So the next thing we need to do is actually put the valves back in the head. So to put valves in a cylinder head, like I did when I was lapping them in, I'm just going to put a little bit of lube on the shaft, because having a bit of lube on your shaft always helps it go in the hole. And then we're going to slip that in, and there'll be a little bit of resistance as we pop past the valve seat, the valve stem seal even. And then the next thing I need is the valve spring and the inner valve spring off, that's the inlet one. And so the closed bit goes at the bottom. Drop them in there, over the top of the valve. Then the next we need is the valve spring compressor, so we're going to hook that in there, and we're going to wind it down, making sure the other side of it is in the middle of the valve. Right, so the thing that retains the valve to the spring is the collet. So they've got a little ridge in here that locates in the valve, and then basically make a cone that sits inside the retainer and holds the valve in the right place. The easiest way, because they're obviously quite fiddly and quite small, the easiest way I've found to secure them is get a little flat blade screwdriver, a little dab of grease. I'm just using some Motul Tech Grease 300, but pretty much any grease will do. And then it sticks on your screwdriver enough to basically drop it in the hole in your valve, in your retainer. Push it to the side a little bit so it's in place. Then you can push your retainer over a little bit, get the second half of your collet, and exactly the same thing on the other side. It is a little bit fiddly, but I've seen people trying to do this with tweezers and all sorts of things, and that's just a faff. Using a little dab of grease on a screwdriver seems to me the easiest system. And then as we wind the valve spring compressor off, it leaves the retainer inside the collets inside the valve retainer, and that's it. That is one valve fitted, just another 7 to do. With the valves and springs and retainers refitted, I have done one little extra trick. I've put the cylinder head on a piece of wood, or a couple of pieces of wood on the edges away from the valves, and I've just gone around with a punch and a hammer and gently just tapped each valve head, and that just makes sure the retainers, the collets and the retainers and everything are seated properly, so that when we start measuring our clearances we know everything's in the right place. Which means now it's time to do clearances. So inside my bucket is a shim. I shall fish the shim out, and you'll see these Aprilia ones, or these 660 ones, have actually got a chamfer. They've got a taper on one side of the shim, and what's happened is at some point during the manufacturing there's an edge down here inside the retainer that's a little bit, almost I suppose, the wrong height, and it's higher than the top of the valve, and so when the shim sits on the top of the valve it could have hit the retainer, and so they are specific valve shims. although I have measured some of these in the past, and the distance down to that ridge is actually lower than the valve head. I'm guessing it was an early batch production issue, so officially they need the specific shim for the RS660. In reality, you can check it, you probably don't need it, but we're going to pop them in there, and then we're going to put the bucket on, like so, and it's a snug fit. Push it down there. I'm going to pop all of those in, and then we can do valve clearances before we fit the head back on the engine. So with the cams in place, I can now do the valve clearance check, and it's much easier if you do this with the engine not on the bench, because then to move the cams you don't have to turn the engine over, which means I don't need to time it up with the cam chain on it. So with the cam cover bolted down and torqued down, I can move the cams enough so that I'll be able to get under enough of the base circle to be able to get my measurement. So that means I'm going to need some feeler gauges. So I have a piece of paper with the shims that are already fitted in place, and then I can just write down what my clearance is and I can work out what shim I actually need, and a selection of feeler gauges. So minimum that it should be is 0.1. Having run the same cams in different engines, I am confident that that will go in, but it doesn't. These ones are slightly different. So that's not going in there. Try it under that. No. Right, we're going to need some smaller shims. Try it on the exhaust side. Feeler gauge goes in quite nicely on the exhaust side. Right, so I know 0.1 fits. So I'll go through them all, see if 0.1 fit, 1.15 fits, and then 0.2. Basically see what's the biggest size I can fit in. So then that will tell me what the clearances are, and that will give me an idea. Well, in fact, it will tell me exactly what size shims I need. With the ones on this side, what I'm going to have to do is fit some smaller, some thinner shims, remeasure until I start getting the clearance I actually want. So I'm now happy that I've got all my clearances set correctly. If I look at the sheet, basically I use some of the shims from up here down to here, I use some of the ones I had in stock into other places, and to get the final couple of clearances bang on, I just need to swap a couple of shims around these two to get it absolutely bang on. But I have to take the cams back out to mount the cylinder head onto the rest of the engine anyway, and so the cams and the cam carrier will be off anyway, so I'll just swap them over. So really the next thing to do is actually to put the cylinder head back on the bottom end. But there is one thing to do first, and that is to clean up around the head gasket area. I tend to run an oil stone across it and just make sure there's no high spots and no imperfections, and the oil stone will do a really good job of clearing any old gasket material off as well. So we'll give it a really good clean, and then we'll get that back on there. So I've used my oil stone, technically the one I've got to India stone, so it's a little bit finer, a little bit softer, and I've just run that across the mating surface there to make sure there's no high spots and clear any old gasket material off. And then I shall get my new head gasket and just drop it down on the studs there, so it sits down on the two dowels. And now my cylinder head is ready to go on. So I'm just going to double check that the sort of mating surface on the cylinder head is absolutely clean and pristine, and then literally lower it down onto the studs and put the nuts on. Cylinder head is on. You've got two little screws here which are 11 Newton meters, and then you've got 6 big nuts that hold the head really down onto the studs, onto the crankcases, and they are 30 Newton meters and 180 degrees, and the idea of that is it pulls the studs into their elastic range, and so basically it pulls everything tighter, basically, and then I'm basically going to say a bit more. Next job then is to put the cams back in and time everything up. So I've just taken the clutch cover off again so I can make sure my locking plate, my locking pin is still holding the crank in position, and then make sure my cam chain is able to go full extension, there's no kinks down this end. So what I'm going to do then next is pop the cams in. I'm going to put a little bit of oil where the cams are going to run. I'm going to pop the cams in, and as I hook the chain on, I've just got to try and get it so that the holes for the pins in the cams will line up with the cam covers. A little bit of a faff, and it might mean I have to take the cams in and out a couple of times to get them on the right tooth location, but it shouldn't be too bad to do. Before I put the cams in, I bolted the cam sprockets on, but not overly tight yet, just nipped up to hold them about in place, because we will need to alter where the cam sits against the sprocket, and then I've bolted them down. Now this one, number 2 inlet, it's on cam, as in the lobes are pointing pretty much straight down onto the bucket, and so that cam wants to sit high, so you have to pull the cam carrier down really quite slowly, bit by bit, and just pull it against the spring tension. If you pull it with just one bolt, there's a chance you could crack the cam carrier, so you've got to be quite patient and pull it down quite slowly. But that's now down. I'm just going to torque it up. They're 11 Newton meters for all the screws. Tighten them up, and then I'm going to cut the cable ties off. The cable ties are there so that when I think I'm in about the right position, it holds the cam chain to the sprocket, so we don't end up like with the cam chain half off and pulling round a tooth. And so it's just a little trick over the years. It can help hold everything in place. So I can cut those off, tighten the bolts down, and then I've just got to tweak the cam round so I can get the bolt or your pin between the cam and then into the cam tower, the cam carrier. This one's nearly lined up, you can see. This one's a little bit out, so we can push that round a little bit and then get all the pins in, and then we can put the cam chain tensioner in, which will, if we see down there, pull the cam chain tight, and once that's in, if all the timing pins are in and the cam chain tensioner is in and released so there's tension, then we can put some Loctite on these bolts, put them back in, torque them up, and that is it, timed up. So with the cams and the cam chain back on, the next thing we're talking about is cam chain tensioner. So this is the cam chain tensioner. It has a spring in it, but it also fills with hydraulic fluid, with oil, and that's it in its extended state. And so we can give it a bit of a squeeze, but it actually takes a reasonable amount of pushing down to compress it all the way. That is how we install it. But when we put it in the bike, we need it to extend out. And to do it that, we have to push it a bit further. So we'll compress it down. This is the bolt that holds it in place. So we'll compress it down, bolt it into the back of the cylinder head like that, and then when we're ready to put some tension on it, take the bolt out and we'll put a pin or a punch in there, give it a little shove, and that will basically push the ratchet together and fire the actual cam chain tensioner out into place. So let's talk. Let's get this inside the engine. So here we go. Cams are locked in position, crank is locked in position, so push the cam chain tensioner in there, follow it with the sort of, I suppose, bolt that holds it in place, get the Allen key in, give it a good nip. When we've got everything in place and I've double checked everything, we will go around and torque it up. So the next thing we need to do is get a pin in there, give it a little shove and tension up the cam chain. So here we go, actually using an Allen key for this. And has that done it? Yes. Just that little shove was enough. Yeah, I can feel like that's released. Yeah, that's definitely released. So now what I can do is cut the cable ties off on my cylinder head, pull my locking pins out, which are actually BMW valves, and then I can turn the engine over, check my valve clearances, and actually make sure all my timing lines timing marks line up again when I do a second rotation of the engine. I nearly missed an important step there. Before I take the timing pins out, what I do need to do is take these bolts out, Loctite them, put them back in and torque them up. Otherwise, when I pull the pins out, the cam could move in its position and then we'd have to retime everything again. So I must remember to tighten those up first. Alternator cover is back off so I can turn the crank. I've been turning that and I've been checking the valve clearances. All the valve clearances are in spec, and I'm just doing a final check to make sure the hole for the crank lines up with the holes, or in fact so that all the holes line up at the same time, so I know the timing is correct. Cam chain is tight, so the last thing I need to do now is double check the torque on the bolt here that holds the cam chain tensioner in, put the cap on that, and then I can put the rocker cover on, put the side covers back on, and we're done. Usefully, Aprilia and Honda and a few other people now are using sort of metal-based gaskets, and so they are reusable. So side covers are both back on. I've changed the spark plugs. We find the standard Iridium ones are fine in a road bike, but in a race bike, we've actually found the CR9 EKBs more reliable. So we've changed the spark plugs, put the coils back on, boxed everything up, and that is nearly ready to go back in the bike. Couple of little tweaks. but it's time for me to clean some tools up and go home. So we're back soon to finish this lump off. So thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more Aprilia action.